In the sweltering haze of a July 2025 night, Seoul pulses with a fervor that borders on sacred. An electric hymn sung by a city reborn, its concrete veins thrumming with the lifeblood of a million restless hearts. The air is thick, heavy with the scent of sweat and asphalt baked by a relentless sun, now sinking into a twilight streaked with crimson and gold. BTS has returned, their military shadows cast aside like cloaks worn too long, threadbare and discarded in the dust of a past they've outgrown. The world bends to their rhythm once more, a symphony of chaos and devotion that reverberates across continents, shaking the foundations of what music can be. 7 titans stand atop a stage that trembles beneath their weight, an edifice of steel and light in the heart of Jamsil Stadium, where 70,000 souls have gathered to bear witness. Their voices are thunder, splitting a sky bruised with anticipation. Their presence a beacon that draws millions into its orbit, a gravitational pull no force can resist. Stadiums quake, the air a tangible thing, dense with screams, humid with collective breath, as armies' devotion unfurls in a sea of purple light sticks, a galaxy of faith reignited after years of longing. And there, amid the blaze, stands Min Yoongi, Suga, his silhouette a stark defiance against the spotlight's relentless glare. A black hoodie shrouds him, its hood pulled low, casting his face in partial shadow. A rebel king cloaked in the garb of the streets he once roamed. His mic is a scepter gripped with quiet command, its surface worn from years of battles fought in soundproof rooms and roaring arenas. He steps forward, the crowd's roar swelling like a tidal wave, and spits his verses with a precision that slices through the chaos. Words sharp as frost, heavy as stone, each syllable a shard of truth honed to a razor's edge. "I've walked through fire," he raps, voice low and guttural, "and turned the ashes to gold." The beat drops, a seismic pulse that rattles the bones of the earth, and the stadium erupts, a cacophony of adoration that could wake the gods. But as the others, RM, Jin, Hoseok, Jimin, Taehyung, Jungkook, surge forward to meet the tide, Suga retreats to the edge, his figure a quiet sentinel at the periphery. The lights catch him then, painting his frame in hues of gold and crimson. And there it is. That smile, a cold, fleeting curl of lips, a crescent of ice in the summer heat, as if he's glimpsed a truth the world cannot fathom. It's not a smile of joy or warmth, not the radiant grin of a man basking in triumph. It's a riddle, a fortress, a whisper of something concealed, a secret woven into the marrow of a man who thrives where light dares not linger. The crowd sees the genius, the Shadow King reborn. His verse is a testament to a mind that bends sound to its will. But they don't see the weight, the invisible burden that presses against his ribs, the gravity that anchors him even as he stands atop the world. That smile, small, miring, almost imperceptible, has become his signature, a mark etched into the collective memory of fans and foes alike. It flickers across screens in high-definition replays, dances in grainy X-posts shared by sleepless devotees, lingers in the hushed awe of concert footage. Suga, mid-rap, pausing to tilt his head, that cold curve tugging at his mouth as if he's mocking the universe itself. Or perhaps himself. Army calls it his shadow aura, a term born in the depths of online forums, whispered in reverence by those who've memorized every slant of his gaze, the way he commands without commanding, his silence a roar louder than any anthem. Critics dissect it, penning essays that mistake it for aloofness, a detachment from the idle machine that churns out polished perfection. They call him distant, unreadable, a cipher in a world of open books. but those who've stood close, his brothers in BTS, the engineers who've watched him sculpt sound from silence, the staff who've caught the flicker in his eyes when the cameras turn away, know better. That smile isn't empty, it's a vault, locking away a storm that rages beneath the frost, a fire that burns where no one can see. It's the smile of a man who's seen the abyss and walked its edge, who's forged beauty from ruin and kept the cost buried deep. Tonight, as the stadium erupts and the lights bathe him in a glow that could rival the sun, that smile holds its secrets tighter than ever, daring the world to look beyond its chill, to ask the question that hums beneath the surface, a melody too faint to grasp, yet too insistent to ignore. What does Suga hide behind his cold smile? The encore begins, a medley of hits that spans a decade of dominance, and Suga moves through it with a grace that belies the tension in his frame. His voice weaves into the harmony, a thread of grit amid the silk of his bandmates' tones, and the crowd sings back every word, their voices a tidal wave that crashes against the stage. He steps to the mic for a solo moment, delivering a line from Decoding, his 2020 war cry as Agosti, and the air ignites, a visceral explosion of sound and light. "Born a slave, now I'm king," he growls, and the stadium shakes as if the earth itself bows to his reign. But as the note fades, he tilts his head again, that cold smile flashing like a blade in the dark, and for a split second, his eyes meet the void beyond the lights, a void that stares back, unblinking. The moment passes, swallowed by the chaos, but it lingers in the minds of those who catch it. A glimpse of something unguarded, a crack in the ice that vanishes before it can be named. To unravel the mystery of that cold smile, we must trace it back, not to the dazzling heights of July 2025, where Suga stands as a colossus astride the world, but to the shadowed streets of Daegu, where Min Yoongi first drew breath on March 9th, 1993. His was no cradle of grandeur, no gilded nursery echoing with lullabies of promise. It was a modest home, its walls worn by time and weather, its floors creaking under the weight of a family's quiet survival. The air was heavy with pragmatism, a scent of rice and toil that clung to the curtains, a rhythm of routine that dictated life's tempo. Yoongi was a quiet child, a boy whose words were sparse, but whose eyes burned with a restless fire, a fire his parents couldn't see, couldn't stoke. They dreamed of stability for him, a desk job behind a counter, a steady wage to keep the wolves at bay. But Yoongi's heart beat to a cadence they couldn't hear, a pulse that thrummed beneath the humdrum of daily life, a song that whispered of something more. At 13, he stumbled into hip-hop's embrace, a genre that roared with the rawness he felt but couldn't voice. It wasn't a gentle discovery. It was a collision, a thunderclap in the silence of his world. Eminem's venom seared through his borrowed earphones. Nas's steel forged a backbone he didn't know he lacked. Epic High's soul painted colours across the grey canvas of his days. They weren't just songs, they were mirrors, reflecting a fury and a yearning he'd buried beneath a placid surface. He'd sit in the dark, the glow of a street lamp slicing through his window, and let the beats wash over him. Each kick drum a heartbeat, each snare a call to arms. Hip-hop wasn't music, it was salvation, a language for a boy who'd learned to swallow his screams. Nights became his sanctuary, a realm where the rules of day dissolved into shadow. While Daegu slumbered beneath a quilt of stars, its streets hushed save for the occasional hum of a scooter or the bark of a stray dog. Yoongi would creep into his brother's room, a battered Walkman, his portal to rebellion. earphones pressed tight against his skull, he'd lose himself in sounds that spoke when he couldn't. Rhymes that carved paths through the chaos of his mind. Beats that echoed the pulse of a dream he couldn't yet name. He scraped together coins from menial tasks, delivering newspapers in the biting dawn, the cold seeping through his thin jacket, sweeping floors in a corner store until his hands ached, the broom a metronome to his thoughts, to claim a second-hand keyboard, its keys chipped and stubborn, its plastic casing cracked from years of neglect. It was a relic, a cast-off from someone else's discarded dreams. But to Yoongi, it was a weapon, a lifeline, a voice. In his cramped bedroom, under a flickering fluorescent bulb that buzzed like a trapped insect against the peeling ceiling, he crafted his first sounds, halting, unpolished, a cacophony of trial and error that grated against the stillness of the night. But beneath the noise was a hunger, a clawing, desperate thing that gnawed at his soul, driving his fingers across the keys until they bled with purpose. He'd hunch over the keyboard, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the wall, a boy wrestling with a beast he couldn't tame. He didn't trumpet his dreams to the rooftops. He didn't need to. They simmered in the dark, a fire banked beneath ash, glowing red and fierce in the quiet. And in those solitary hours, the seeds of that cold smile took root, not yet a mask, but a shield, a way to guard the flame within from a world that might douse it with doubt, a world that saw a skinny kid with no future and not the titan he'd become. By 17, he was Gloss, a fleeting blaze in Daegu's underground rap scene, a name that shimmered briefly but burned bright in the haze of cigarette smoke and cheap liquor, in dim basements and makeshift stages where the air reeked of sweat and desperation. He faced rappers twice his age, their weathered faces etched with skepticism, their smirks daring him to prove himself. He'd step to the mic, his frame slight but unyielding, and unleash verses that cut like knives, lines heavy with frustration, sharp with ambition, dark with a pain he couldn't yet name, a pain that coiled in his chest like a serpent waiting to strike. I was angry, he'd later confess in a 2020 interview, his voice low and rough, eyes fixed on some unseen horizon as if peering into that past. At everything, the world, myself, the shit I couldn't change. His words were a torrent, a flood of raw energy that stunned the room into silence. The older rappers' jeers dying in their throats as this kid, this nobody, laid bare a soul they couldn't match. He'd finish a set, chest heaving, sweat beading on his brow, the mic trembling in his grip as the last echo faded into the stale air. Then he'd vanish into the haze, slipping through the crowd like a ghost, leaving his verses to linger like riddles in the dim light, crude recordings on borrowed mics, tapes that crackled with static but pulsed with life. Gloss was a spark, a fleeting flare in a scene that chewed up dreamers and spat them out, but it was Suga who would become the inferno, a flame that burned cold, a fire that hid its heat beneath layers of ice, a secret he'd carry forward into a destiny he couldn't yet see. When Yoongi auditioned for Big Hit Entertainment in 2010, he brought that fire and that shield with him, a raw-edged gem in a sea of polished hopefuls. He wasn't the idle mold, too quiet, too rough, his edges too jagged for the industry's glossy veneer, but his fire was undeniable, a blaze that flickered in his verses, a mind that raced beyond the confines of expectation. He stood before the judges, a skinny 17-year-old in a worn jacket, his voice steady as he rapped about dreams and despair, his gaze unyielding even as his hands trembled at his sides. They saw potential, a diamond in the rough, and took the gamble. BTS debuted in 2013 with No More Dream, a rebel's hymn stamped with his hand. Lyrics that spat at conformity, beats that pulsed with resolve, a sound that dared the world to listen. As the group soared, defying odds and shattering ceilings, Suga's role crystallized, the quiet one, the shadow amid the blaze. RM's intellect dazzled with its labyrinthine depth, Jin's warmth soothed like a balm on weary souls, Jungkook's radiance captivated with its boundless glow. But Suga lingered at the edges, his presence a gravitational pull, a silent force that anchored the chaos. His verses were blades, carving truths from the ether, each word a stroke of genius that cut deeper than any choreography could reach. He didn't leap into the spotlight. He didn't need to. He stood apart, his stillness a power that drew eyes without effort, his contribution a heartbeat beneath the surface of every track. It was then that the cold smile began to solidify, not as aloofness, but as armor, a frost that grew over the cracks life had carved into him. In interviews, while his bandmates bantered and laughed, Jimin's giggles spilling like sunlight, Taehyung's deep chuckles rumbling like distant thunder, Suga would sit back, observing. His posture relaxed, but his mind a storm behind those sharp eyes. He'd offer quips that landed like perfectly timed drumbeats, dry and biting, cutting through the noise with surgical precision. "I don't talk much," he said once in a 2017 broadcast, that smile tugging at his lips, a faint curve that didn't reach his eyes. "But when I do, people listen." And they did. Fans leaning closer to screens, hosts pausing mid-sentence, the room shifting to his rhythm without him raising his voice. Fans dubbed it his shadow aura, a term coined in the sprawling digital warrens of fan forums, whispered in reverence by those who'd spent years decoding his every glance, every pause. It was the way he could dominate a room without trying, his silence a force that spoke louder than screams, a presence that filled spaces he didn't even occupy. But behind that smile, something shifted. A wall rising brick by brick, a frost that thickened with every milestone, every scar life etched into his being. The 2014 shoulder injury, a delivery accident from his pre-debut days when a car sent him sprawling across pavement, shattering bone and dreams, left a mark he'd carry forever. The surgery came later in 2020, but the pain lingered. A dull ache he masked with that cold curve, a grimace he turned into a weapon. The 2016 release of Agasti bared his soul to the world, a sonic confession that shook the earth beneath fans' feet. The last was its bleeding heart, a raw howl of depression, anxiety, and the suffocating weight of ambition. "I thought I'd die at 20, he rapped, his voice cracking like glass underfoot. "But I'm here, spitting fire through the pain." Fans clutched headphones, tears staining their cheeks. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, a gut punch of honesty in an industry of artifice. Yet even there, the cold smile lingered, in the stark frames of the music video, where he stared down the lens with eyes that saw too much, in the way he dropped the tape without fanfare, a single X-post. Listen, and let it speak for itself. He bared his soul, but not all of it. Lines like "the shadow behind my smile" and "a stage built on lies" hinted at depths he wouldn't name, truths he kept locked behind that icy curve, leaving the world to wonder what else lay beneath. One night in late 2019 stands as a turning point, a moment uncaught by cameras, but seared into the fabric of Suga's soul, a wound that bled ink instead of blood. BTS was at its zenith. Map of the soul. Persona. A global conquest. Their tour a relentless march across continents, a juggernaut of sound and spectacle that left cities trembling in its wake. Yoongi stood backstage in Los Angeles, the roar of 60,000 fans a distant hum through the concrete walls of the Staples Center, a muffled tide that lapped at the edges of his awareness. His shoulder throbbed, a ghost of pain that never faded, a reminder of the crash that had nearly ended him before he'd begun. His mind buzzed with a weariness that sleep couldn't touch, a static that drowned out the world and left him adrift. The others laughed nearby, Jimin's giggle a bright thread weaving through the air, Hoseok's chatter a warm pulse that filled the space with life. But Yoongi stayed apart, leaning against a crate, his hoodie pulled tight around him like a cocoon. He stared at the floor, the scuffed concrete a canvas for thoughts he couldn't escape, his breath shallow and uneven. A staffer approached, her footsteps soft against the din, concern creasing her brow beneath the dim glow of a headset mic. "You good, Yoongi-si?" she asked, voice tentative, as if afraid to breach the wall he'd built. He lifted his head, that cold smile flickering to life, a reflex, a shield, but his eyes betrayed him. For a split second, they glinted with something raw, something unguarded, a crack in the frost that shimmered like a tear caught in the light, a vulnerability so fleeting it might have been a trick of the shadows. He nodded, the smile tightening, and muttered, "Yeah, just tired," his voice a gravelly whisper that barely carried. She hesitated, then stepped away, leaving him to the silence that swallowed her retreat. Later, alone in his hotel room, the smile trembled. Not visibly, not to the world, but within, a seismic shift that cracked the ice he'd layered over his soul. The room was a sterile box, its walls a muted beige, its windows framing a city that glittered like a mirage beyond the glass. He sat at a desk, a notebook open before him, its pages blank save for the ghosts of erased words, a pen clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The neon glow of Los Angeles seeped through the blinds, casting slivers of light across his face, gold and blue and red, a kaleidoscope that danced over his skin but couldn't pierce the dark within. He didn't write a song that night. He wrote a confession to himself, to the boy he'd been, to the shadow he'd become. "I'm tired," he scrawled, the ink bleeding into the page like blood from a wound, the letters jagged and uneven as his hand shook with the weight of truth. Tired of pretending it doesn't hurt, tired of smiling when it does. The words poured forth, a torrent unleashed after years of restraint, about the crash that scarred his shoulder, the metal twisting around him as he hit the pavement, the doctor's voice echoing in his ears. "You might never play again." About the nights he'd stared at ceilings, the plaster a map of his doubts, wondering if he'd gone too far to turn back, if the dream was worth the cost. About the voices in his head, relentless and cruel, whispering he'd never be enough. Not for BTS, not for ARMY, not for the kid who dared to dream in Daegu. That cold smile, he realized, wasn't just a shield. It was a cage, locking away a part of him he feared the world wouldn't embrace. A part too fragile, too human, too real to survive the glare of the spotlight. He wrote until the pen slipped from his fingers, until the page was a battlefield of ink and anguish, until the city outside faded into a dawn he didn't see. And when he finally looked up, the mirror across the room caught his reflection, a man with shadowed eyes, a cold smile that lingered like a habit, and a fire that flickered beneath it all, refusing to die. He didn't tear the page out. He didn't burn it. He closed the notebook, slid it into a drawer, and let the silence take him, a silence that held his secrets, a silence that fueled the flame he'd never let the world extinguish. What does Suga hide behind his cold smile? Not weakness, not shame, but a flame. A fire that burns beneath the frost, a light he guards with a ferocity that borders on holy, a beacon he shielded from a world that might not understand its heat. It's the boy who dreamed in a Daegu bedroom, hunched over a keyboard that groaned under his touch, his breath fogging in the winter chill as he chased a sound no one else could hear. It's the rapper who bled into basement mics, his voice raw and ragged, his verses a lifeline in a sea of doubt. It's the man who turned his scars into anthems, who took the pain of a broken shoulder and a fractured mind and forged them into gold. Interlude, Shadow, Daichwita, The Last, tracks that resonate with millions because they carry the weight he won't speak aloud. It's the pain he won't name, not the ache of old wounds, not the sting of nights spent alone, not the quiet grief for dreams he buried to lift others higher. It's the losses he won't mourn aloud, friends lost to the streets of Daegu, moments stolen by a life that moves too fast, a piece of himself left behind in the rush to become Suga. It's the love he keeps buried beneath layers of ice, a love for his brothers in BTS who he'd shield with his life, a love for ARMY who he'd carry on his back if he could, a love for music, the only thing that's never betrayed him. That smile isn't a mask of indifference, it's a vow to himself, to his 6 companions, to the millions who chant his name, that he'll carry the weight so they don't have to, that he'll burn bright in the dark so they can see, that he'll hold the line even when his own edges fray. Now, in July 2025, as BTS storms the world anew, that smile remains, on stages that bow beneath their power, in studios where he bends sound to his will, in fleeting glimpses online that spark 1,000 theories. Whispers of a new August D project swirl, a cryptic X post, ice melts, igniting a firestorm of speculation, a new mixtape, a confession, a revelation of the man behind the frost. The question echoes louder with every beat, every glance. What lies behind it? The answer isn't simple, isn't singular. It's a tapestry of a life fiercely lived, a mosaic of triumphs and trials, a flame that's weathered storms and emerged unbroken. Suga keeps this secret not out of fear, but out of reverence for the fire that fuels him. A fire he's tended in silence. A fire he'll unveil only when the world is ready to feel its warmth. A fire that burns cold and eternal behind that enigmatic, icy smile.